Welcome to Rise from Switzerland, where yesterday over 62% of the population and 22 of 24 cantons reapproved the COVID certificate law, which had been approved only 4 months ago, and where my daughter, who is studying in Scotland, returned home yesterday, sneaking in just before the new travel restrictions kick in today. I am Professor Demian Hodari of VHL Hospitality Business School, Lausanne.
And from lovely London, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world. Thank you for joining us on Rise. We are in day 588 of our 100-day labor of love. And as has been seen in the last 5 days, we continue as a travel, tourism, and hospitality industry to need a place that separates the news from the noise. As Professor Hodari has intimated, it's been a very challenging time. There have been a lot of changes that have taken place and changes that are still ahead as we all head towards the end of the year and a critical time for travel. But we need to prepare ourselves because things are changing rapidly. So Rise, as always, is here for you, with you, and because of you to keep you committed and inspired about our incredible industry and all that is ahead. We have a very exciting program today. Thank you for everyone joining us on the Zoom link, which allows you to get involved in our Q&A and also to vote. So thank you for doing that. We're also operating, as you know, on Facebook and YouTube Live. We've also got a LinkedIn platform that's been developed. So we are delighted to have people with us from around the world. We have an interesting one today. Firstly, because as has been said very clearly, we have a new variant of COVID that is circulating around the world. Omicron was established on Thursday. It's now appearing in countries right across every single region, and we need to understand what we need to understand to react correctly and not get caught up in the panic, separating the news from the noise. But importantly, on top of that, we know that destinations around the world rely on the arts. And for someone who is a lover of live ballet, to go back to the theater was incredible. But we've always wondered, how has the theater community survived in the last year and a half, almost 2 years? We have a backstage pass. We have an incredible executive in residence. So a great program to keep you all focused, inspired, and your chins up and your spirits on the rise. Professor Hodari, anything else you want to add about today?
I think we've got a great intel report from Euromonitor. And just to reiterate this link with the theater world, I think there's a lot of parallels between hospitality and theater, just like there is between the hospitality industry and tourism and education. So it'd be fun to explore that with everybody. And talking about exploring things with everybody, as our regular audience knows, we like to always begin exploring things with our audience. So we've got our first and only poll of the day that's going to magically appear now. So with the latest news on the new COVID variant, are you considering canceling your end of year travel plans? Please choose one of the following. All right, we'll see those results in just a little while. Anita?
I must say, Demian, as challenging as some of our questions would be, I love our music. My shoulders just start going. So it always balances out what might be a difficult question.
As long as you don't start singing along with it, I think we're fine.
That's an idea for season 5. So as we always do with Rise, we want to get a sense of what do you need to know right now? Where in the world are we? As we've intimated, again, there's been a lot of change in the last 96 hours, but I wanted to go a little bit back before that and give a sense of, again, how do we as the travel and tourism industry get a sense of how is our world changing for the positive and also when it's challenging? We've talked a lot recently about after almost 600 days, Australia started opening up. It was a long time. And what I found very interesting about showing this, and this is why we show it today, Forward Keys is, as we all know, a brilliant source of intelligence when it comes to actual bookings. And what's been important about this one and why we're showing it, it actually depicts as soon as there was a reopening of international travel for people from Australia, the bookings surged. Where is interesting on this? Reason being, we have said on Rise from the very beginning, when people get a chance to travel again, it's going to be heart before holiday. Everyone has missed someone. Me and my team, we've all been separated from hugs with Professor Hodari for almost 600 days. So it's a question of saying, where are people going? And I thought these bookings were very interesting to see immediately the spikes of people in Australia, many who've been locked in for almost 2 years, going across to the UK, going to Singapore, going across to USA. It shows the quickness, the shortness of lead time, and the quickness of response as soon as borders open up. And we'll go into in a later stage what happens when they shut down again. But I thought this was very interesting because from the point of view of planning, whether it's in hospitality, aviation, whatever it might be, my goodness, how difficult is this when decisions are being made so quickly and the surge of demand escalates so rapidly, equally the surge of collapse. I thought I'd share that today.
Very interesting. I've got something a little bit, well, quite a bit different. I thought we'd take a look at the labor issue. This seems to be the only thing everybody wants to talk about in the hospitality, the hotel industry. And we all know that there's a shortage of employees right now. People have not come back to work as we had expected them to at this stage of the crisis of the pandemic. And so this shortage of employees, naturally demand and supply. One way to attract people or to retain them is through salary. And you can see here, we just look at sort of in the middle there, January 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were paying about $14.50 an hour to non-supervisory employees in the hospitality and leisure industries. And we're at $16.50 now. So that's about a 15% increase. So it looks like a dramatic increase, but it really still is only a couple dollars more per hour. But it is demonstrating the fact that the industry is struggling to find people, because the only reason anybody in the hospitality industry raises labor wages is if a law requires it, or if they simply can't find anybody to work at the rates that they're paying. And so this does not address some of the underlying conditions about well-being of people in this industry. Many people have left the industry not just because of salary, but for general working conditions. But it is at least a indication that the industry is trying desperately to attract and retain employees. And I'll be curious to see how this relates to the theater industry in a little while with Paul.
Indeed, great one. And it does show as well how difficult it is for businesses to rebuild again. Not only are they trying to recover the business that's been lost in the last year and a half, but now the cost of doing business is escalating. So a great one to show, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks. And now it's time, I think, for our Intel report from Euromonitor.
Indeed. We have one of our lovely former executives in residence from Euromonitor, Carolyn Bremner, taking us through a great perspective, as Euromonitor always does, on some insight into how travel purchases changed because of all of us migrating online. Now, I'm sure many people watching will be able to understand this completely, but we thought this was fabulous. And this is fresh data that was just released at the beginning of November. So thank you to Caroline and Euromonitor for sharing it with Rise.
Global travel and tourism felt the full force of the COVID-19 pandemic, with spending on international tourism falling by 75% in 2020. It was one of the first sectors to close and the last to reopen. Despite this, consumers still love to travel. Staycations and workations are testament to a pent-up demand to explore and discover new places, cultures and experiences. This chart, part of Euromonitor's Travel Rewired, Innovation Strategies for a Resilient Recovery report just released 2 weeks ago at World Travel Market 2021, shows world travel sales by channel 2019 to 2026. Interesting to note is that, as we've all seen through our e-commerce behaviour, the pandemic has accelerated digitalisation as businesses pivot online. Mobile travel sales are expected to regain all lost ground by 2022, hitting almost $500 billion. Online travel will continue to grow, accounting for 54% of travel sales in 2021. Importantly, online sales gained 5 years' worth of growth during the pandemic. All of this shows the growing desire for people to not only travel, but put travel decision-making back in their hands.
Yeah, some interesting things there. That last point about what's happened over the last year is just, puts really a lot of things in perspective for me.
Indeed.
All right, we've got some headlines for our audience, as we always do, and I get to go first. So it almost seems trivial now, given the dramatic news of the last few days, but I don't want us to lose sight of underlying issues that I've been here for a while and they're going to continue for a while longer, no matter what happens with this variant, whether it turns out to be more dangerous or less dangerous or more prevalent or not. And so let's not lose focus of some of the underlying important issues. So this one is about hotel companies and REITs enhancing portfolios with capital projects. So what this is basically saying is the same thing as another article that I was going to show, which is that all of the owners of hotels, they've got some money sitting around and they want to invest this. And one thing that's happening as well is owners are being required by the brands to invest money, this capital expenditure, to renovate and reposition their hotels. And this is a big problem, primarily because many hotel owners, especially smaller individual owners, that in their contracts with the brands do put aside money every year for future renovations. We call this a reserve for replacement or an FF&E fund. They had to tap into that during the early days of the pandemic to pay off their debt because they had no income coming in. And this was before they shut down or before banks and government stepped in to make things a little bit easier for owners. So these reserves, these funds that should have, in some cases, many millions of dollars ready to be spent to upgrade hotels when required, those funds have been depleted. And meanwhile, the brands and hotel operators are requiring this of owners in many cases, and the owners are just simply saying, we don't have the funds to do this. And while there's been a lot of flexibility from the brands and the operators to owners and a lot of support for them during the crisis, they're being kind of strict here. And I think what it comes down to is rates are back to pre-pandemic or even above pre-pandemic levels, largely because of leisure demand. But customers are not receiving the same level of service as they were before. There's less employees in the hotels, many of them are newer, they're not as well trained. So what are we going to do to provide our guests with as equal value as before if it's not from service? Well, it's got to be from a renovated hotel, more modern facilities, more technology. And so they need the owners to invest that in order to make sure that the brands stay relevant for the customers. The owners don't really necessarily have the money for that. You do have some of the larger funds and REITs with money that can do this. And so I think we're going to see a disparity again, not only between large institutional owners and individual owners on their ability to generate profit, but also their ability to position their hotels. And I think longer term, let's say 3-5 years, I think you're going to see the individual hotelier struggling even more than they have been.
You make a really good point, Demian, and I love the fact that you brought this up because an important part of RISE is keeping people not just understanding of what's happening in the industry, but empathetic towards it. And this is an important one because, as we've been saying, hotels have had to commit to investing in the new protocols. They've had to adjust to lower numbers of people involved. But equally, as you've said, they need to reposition. Many of them are repurposing. Many of them are actually taking hotels, cruise ships, whatever they might be, out of having been mothballed. That costs a lot of money. So at a time when people don't have ultimately the cash flow, on top of that, they're needing to invest just to bring the businesses back to life in a next normal way. That is absolutely something that we need to be very empathetic and sympathetic towards, because as we've always said, there's no back to normal. It's about the next normal. And the next normal is allowing the dust to be blown off, the fresh air to blow in, and a connection and a relevance to what is the future of travel. It's much more focused on the protocols, it's much more focused on service, and it's much more focused on new needs, with the entire world having shifted in terms of how it engages in hospitality and travel. So this is a really important one to make sure we all don't expect the doors to just open up again and we continue as if nothing happened in the last 2 years. Thank you for that. So building on that, my headline is actually an ouch one, and I thank very much the Backstage team and the Wizards of Oz for being able to allow a slide shift, because as much as we prepare all of our work for RISE in advance to get everything ready for you, the viewers, I had to sneak this one in. This is actually a headline that's taken, it's a screenshot from my television. And this is from Friday, when on Thursday night, a new strain of COVID was identified. By Friday morning, we had 7 countries that were red listed by the UK. Now, a red list from the UK, the big issue there is not just the fact that it's a little bit unnerving in terms of are people wanting to travel to the country, but that means that anyone traveling from these countries back to the UK, like I did back in early April, faces 10 days of hotel quarantine, 10 days in a government facility with little brown boxes of meals 3 times a day at the cost of, at that time, £1,750 sterling cost to the passenger. What the point of this was that on Thursday, the strain was identified. On Friday, red listings occurred, which is ultimately black listings. We also have in the corner, which is teeny tiny, so I apologize for the eye test, an indicator of how stocks in the travel industry dropped double digit. So whether it's airlines or cruises, how they plummeted, and yet pharmaceutical stocks started to rise again. The issue here is not just the red ink, the negatives, the challenges happened. It's the speed. It's the speed at which governments are reacting to a challenge and a fear. Now, we raise this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to alert people that ultimately, as we've always said before, this is an economic crisis and a travel and tourism crisis and hospitality crisis. It's a healthcare crisis. The focus needs to be on the WHO and what we are establishing about what exactly this variant is. How does it travel? How transmissible is it? How does it respond to the vaccine? How does it respond for non-vaccinators? As importantly, we need to be really, really clear of what does this mean for our industry in terms of how do we then move through it? This moment in time has been incredibly painful, and it's why my team is absolutely spirit exhausted from the last 96 hours, because it's like someone sticking their foot out at the finish line of a race at the end of a marathon and tripping the athlete. People were looking at going into the year end and having their weddings finally rebooked, finally having holidays, finally having family reunions, and suddenly borders are shutting. This was on Friday. We've now seen Japan has closed its borders. Israel's about to go into a state of emergency. Countries around the world have now covered every region in terms of where cases have been identified. Everywhere in the world is watching everywhere in the world. But we need to be really careful about what we are watching is an indicator. So I, who am due to be traveling to Cape Town on the 10th of December until middle of January, I have no idea if I'm traveling. It doesn't help me to contact the airline to ask them. They don't know yet. They're focusing on the immediate. So as the WHO starts looking at what exactly this means, we all need to make sure we're looking at the right analysis. But my point being, this shows how almost 2 years into a global pandemic, the world is still extremely, extremely cautious. We've seen Christmas markets in Germany being shut down even before this happened. We've seen, as a result, travelers that are on Christmas tours, whether it's Kentucky, Trafalgar, Uniworld, whatever it is, having to now get back home again. This is a really scary case of deja vu to Q2 2020. All we're saying is, please, everyone, stay calm, stay focused, stay supportive, stay empathetic, and stay hopeful, because we will get through this. There will be another variant in the future. We will continue as the world to move through it. We just need to make sure we react by staying centered in the eye of the storm. Professor, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I have a question for you. We debated, I think on the last episode, we talked a little bit about whether our industry has done enough to prepare for a future pandemic, but let's look at it in terms of a future variant. Are we overreacting, or are we being more proactive, doing things quicker? Have we learned from the previous variants and lockdowns that we need to act quickly and know what's going on before we can relax? Or are we overreacting? I don't think we can actually answer it because we don't know the degree to the and seriousness of this variant. And so I've had a lot of students talking to them today, wondering if they should leave, if they should stay here, should they go home for the holidays? What if they can't come back to school? Are we going to classes go back online? And nobody knows. And I'm just wondering, what you think about this reaction versus overreaction.
It's such an important point. Two things. Firstly, back at the beginning when we created Rise, you made a really, really interesting comment in the initial comms about Rise, and you said, we are a living case study. We're living it real time. You wrote that, and it was a brilliant point, and it's increased in its importance, Professor, in terms of what it means. There is no case study. We are the case study. So to your point, we're all living this, and your grandchildren are going to be the ones who will look back to when Grandpa Hodari was actually living this time. This is what they learned. So to your point, I idealistically believe people are making the best judgment calls they can based on what they know. The question is, do we know what is important to make decisions on? Is it based on what people are saying and seeing, or is it the data? There is so much not yet known about this variant. The overreaction, the quick reaction, the whatever we want to call it, the speed of reaction with this new variant, with Omicron being identified and suddenly, again, immediately red lists, closures, panic. It goes back very much to Delta. When Delta was identified in India, there was a time lag between when Delta started to spread, which was then the Indian variant. And we've learned now, stop calling it by the country names because it unnecessarily prejudices a nation. And quite honestly, a country that has the scientific expertise to identify a new strain and call it out should be celebrated, not cursed. So Delta was identified, but the containment efforts of it were delayed. As a result, it spread at a higher rate than anyone would have hoped for and caused more damage than anyone anticipated. The pendulum has swung. So from the experience of the delay in Delta, there's been a speed of response in terms of Omicron. That's the important thing about it. Somewhere in between there is the right timing. What is vital is that when a new strain is identified, which will happen again, it needs to be identified, and the scientific community needs to be allowed to do their jobs, but with the right communication lines to communicate it out to who they need to mobilize the global medical community. The WHO, like for instance in the US, when we have hurricane season, the hurricanes are already pre-named. So the next one already has a next name. The speed of naming is vital. So if we look at Omicron from Thursday afternoon in South Africa until Friday, late Friday, when it was named, that 36 hours ultimately became about a strain that was identified in South Africa, that was named in South Africa. Sadly, that was the reference point. Naming them quickly, agnostically is absolutely vital so that the people ultimately, again, with the expertise and the courage to identify it, are able to, so that the world is safe, rather than penalizing a part of the world that it happened to have been identified in. So to your point, the overreaction is, I believe, a lot of muscle memory, that there have been leaders who have just been fearful of not wanting to have the Delta example replicated now with Omicron. So it's really interesting. What's also very important about this, we are seeing a lot of the transmission is about spread. In my heart, my concern is that vaccine focus is now going on booster shots. Yet there's a huge part of the world that hasn't yet had full vaccination, full round. We need to make sure that vaccination production can be put in place so that the entire world baseline of vaccination of those who want to be vaccinated can be supplied, and then move everyone safely forward. Because as long as we have large parts of the world unvaccinated, the risk of transmission is escalated dramatically. So long answer to your question, my apologies, but hopefully that gives some context.
And that's all the time we've got for today.
All right, so on that note, I'm going to hand it over to a man who is very much a loved contributor to Rise. He is a very dearly loved colleague of mine from CNN, and he's given us a great little video to show that even us in the travel, tourism, and hospitality industry, people like you and me, Professor, who love our industry, sometimes not just talking about hospitality is important, but actually being the tourists and being able to enjoy parts of the world where hospitality is at their heart. Excellent.
Hello, I've spent long enough telling everybody else the importance of getting away. having a break, a mental easing up, if you will, after all we've been through. So finally I've decided to take my own advice, and Chris and I have come to Phuket in Thailand on our delayed honeymoon. A rest, a break, a chance to get away from it all. But still a chance to make some observations. Thailand is just opening up after its long lockdown, and tourist numbers are starting to return. They've got an interesting, slightly complicated, but will get easier Thailand Pass system to ensure safety for those who live here and for tourists alike. We managed to negotiate it without too many problems. What is clear is that Thailand and all the countries that rely on tourism are desperate that we do visit soon.
I thought that was great. It's just a very human perspective of why we all need to make sure that however we do it, we take a break and we feed those tourism countries.
I hope people can keep traveling over the next few months. It's incredible the number of people who've contacted me, and I am not a travel expert, as you know, asking should they cancel their trip, should they be rebooking, what are the airlines and hotels going to do? I don't know, and I don't think they know. All right, let's see what our audience knows, or at least what they think, and with the answer to our first poll. All right, Anita, I never made any plans.
Wow.
See, interesting, right? People are still, I guess it's people are still suspicious and waiting as opposed to not wanting to travel.
It's such an interesting one because we've been saying for so long, Professor, that why bother is going to be a really big part of the future of travel. That for a lot of people, the risk, the cost, the frustration, why bother? That's quite. Thank you for everyone who contributed, because that honesty of response says a lot. So thank you for that.
And it's time now for our executive in residence, Anita.
Indeed, and appropriately, we need a drum roll because we have a very special. As I said, I'm one who loves going to the theatre, and I was so excited last year when particularly the Royal Opera House in London opened up. But what was amazing, aside from being in the theatre, was when you could feel the applause of the audience, you could feel how it fed the performers who've been on their own and haven't had that food for so long. And for the audience, how good it was to be back together again, even if we were all masked up. So we wanted to get a sense of, goodness me, the theatre community is such an important part of our industry. How did they survive? And we found the perfect person who's going to give us, again, the backstage pass to understand how did the theatre community, especially in London, a global city that is so important in terms of understanding the value of people coming here to go to theatre, whether it's in London, whether it's in Richmond, whether it's in Stratford-upon-Avon, wherever it might be. Very exciting. So we welcome to the Rise stage Paul Miller. He's the artistic director for the Orange Tree Theatre in London, England, and he's the winner of the Best Artistic Director of the Off West End Awards. So, Paul, welcome to the stage, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome, Paul. I guess I'm going to start with my question. I know Anita's got questions as well. I want to establish this link between the relationship or similarities or not between hospitality, tourism, and theater. And so we've lost a lot of employees in our industry who were laid off or furloughed during the early stages of the pandemic, and then realized during it that, you know what, there's better things out there. There are better paying jobs with better conditions, companies that might treat them better in many cases. And so they've left the industry. There's been plenty of jobs in other industries, Amazon, hiring everywhere. And I'm wondering if you've seen anything similar in your industry in terms of the employees' relationship to the industry and to the establishments that employ them.
Absolutely. What's happened in this country is the government did one absolutely amazing thing for the theatre industry, which was the Cultural Recovery Fund, which is a £1.57 billion fund specifically to support all the cultural organisations that needed it to survive. So this was a complete game changer because last summer, many of us thought we would simply not survive at all as businesses. So that was extraordinary. What they felt less able to do was to support in any real way the many thousands of freelance workers that make up the industry. And every play, production, show, musical, whatever event that you go to will come together through a coalition of things. It will be infrastructure, the companies with permanent employees and buildings like I run, and a huge team of freelance workers, whether they be artists, designers, directors, musicians, but also technicians of all kinds. And it was they that suffered the brunt. And what's happened is that the organizations received a lot of support, and that's where we're still standing, which is fantastic. What was really, really worrying and continues to be a worry is that all the many tens of thousands of fascinating, talented people that we rely on to make theatre with suffered a lot financially. And yes, they had historically been less well paid, relative to what they could earn in the outside world, as it were. And the combination of those things meant that they had to find a way of earning a living in the last 18 months. And of course, a lot of the people we're talking about have huge transferable skills. So if you're a technician or a lighting designer, if you're a stage manager, you've got a lot of real skills that you've traditionally not been paid enough for, that you can take elsewhere to other work marketplaces. And so that's what's happened, is that people perhaps have either decided to leave our industry completely because of that historic feeling that it wasn't going to work out for them anyway, and now they're under huge pressure, or they've temporarily taken other kinds of work, which now leaves them in a bind because the theatre is coming back. We've got jobs to offer and things we want to work with people on. And just the other day was a classic example of a really brilliant lighting designer that we know took himself off to do a job in a completely different business, was lucky enough to get a full-time job. He's now in a bind. We want him to do a play, but to do so, you'd have to give up a permanent job. What does he do? So that's just one example of sort of millions of examples that we're finding, so that it may have been naive of us to think, well, look, this is all terrible, but once we get back as employers, and thank God, here we are, we're still alive, we're still in business, great, we've got a lot of work to offer people. Suddenly, it's not exactly that they're not there, it's that people have had to find other things to do. And so we're in a more complicated position than we thought we were going to be.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up. So do you think the industry, you mentioned we were maybe perhaps naive, which I think is the same thing that happened in the hospitality industry. How is your industry changing, or how will it change to address this going forward, or is there no clear path forward yet?
Well, let's have the good news first, right? Human beings desire to gather together and have stories enacted by them, for them, in front of them, is absolutely primal and is not going anywhere. It's a thousands of years old art form that is deeply rooted in being a human being. So the theatre will survive. The logistics of it as a business now probably mean that, quite rightly, people need to be better treated and better paid. And we've already, when we've come back, even though we've come back in quite a limited, in some ways quite compromised form, which I can go into, we've already made changes in the way we work with people, the hours we expect people to work, etc. And I think those adjustments will go on as we sort of really begin to learn what the lessons are. I think there was a feeling in my business, and I don't know about anybody else perhaps, but that while the lockdowns were happening, we were all learning the lessons, and that when we came back, those lessons would have been learned. I think it's not as simple as that. I think we're on a long, long process, and I think lessons are only now beginning to be learned, and I think it's going to be a process.
It's a great point you make, Paul, because and it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the impact on travel and tourism with the new variant, that when you hear people say we need to learn to live with COVID, we need to live with it, but we need to learn. And so 2 years later, we shouldn't be reacting so quickly because we haven't learned. Question for you, though, because I remember when my guilty pleasure British Vogue when I get a chance to just curl up and switch off and not think of anything else in the world. And Dame Judi Dench did an interview middle of last year, and she was saying that she didn't think, it was in British Vogue, it was brilliant, and she said she didn't think she'd be alive when British theatre reopened. And that was quite, wow. I mean, that was haunting. Can you give us just a sense of, because we all have our favorite theaters, we all have our favorite elements, and to your point, I think the people who go to see the arts have a heightened appreciation for the artists and the opportunity to go now. As much as we can see it on Netflix, on BBC, on whatever, it's not the same as being there. Can you give us a sense of scale of, as an example, the operating world you live in? How many people are we talking about in terms of those that were affected, the community size of the arts community, the number of theaters, et cetera, just to give some sensitization of scale that we're talking about?
Yeah, so one of the symptoms of the problem about how to focus on freelancers is that there's never been a sort of agreed measure of who those people are, because people often have what they call portfolio careers. They might spend part of the time across the year working in the theatre and part not. But it does run to hundreds of thousands of people. And certainly upwards of 1,000 organisations have been saved by the Cultural Recovery Fund. So we are a big business. And I think one of the things that the fund, why this fund was the size it was, is because the government can understand that though we may be thought to be on the entertainment end of things and thus maybe not a priority to some people, we are a big industry and we bring in a lot in VAT on ticket sales alone. So the wider cultural industry, I'm pleased to see that the government really does know how incredibly important it is. And of course, if for no other reason, then it is a generative industry for all hospitality industries. So hotels and restaurants and bars around theatre districts that rely on things happening on stage. And so I think the government got that at a big level. So that's why we're all here, because they understand that it's a big business.
And it's interesting you say that, because I'm right around the corner from Victoria Theatre, where Hamilton is. And you could feel the disappointment with the closures and the excitement when it opened up again. And I think that's where, to your point, it's people often forget just how much happens behind the velvet curtain that we forget about. But as you say, people had to make choices out of survival. In hindsight, we can look back, but at the time, no one had a clue what was going to be happening.
Yeah. The feeling at the moment in London is that there's a sort of a lot of contradictory things going on. And one of them is, it looks as if the public, if we can generalize about the public in any way, are prepared to take the risk to go to see and spend a lot of money on one piece of event theatre that will be pure entertainment, and they're prepared to sit in a big theatre for that to happen. But there's a lot of evidence that the kind of serious theatre going, where it's a sort of year-round commitment and you go several times a week and you don't necessarily expect to love everything, but you're sort of committed to it as an art form, that habit has been broken at the moment. And so a lot of what theatre making in London is about is trying to think how we re-establish that habit, and how we address one of the many contradictions coming out of the pandemic, assuming we are coming out of it, which is, yes, people on the one hand want pure entertainment. There's a lot of people that want to go to one big thing that is pure entertainment, but there's an equally strong feeling from both within the business and I think theatre goers that theatre needs to address the world with a new seriousness. We've learned a lot about ourselves, I think, funnily enough. I'm loath to acknowledge any good side to this pandemic. However, one phenomenon is, I do think that a lot more people know a lot more now about how different people live. And there is a strong desire for the theatre to reflect that and examine that. And so I don't think yet the theatre has quite got into its stride in terms of A, re-establishing audience confidence in coming at all, but B, how to get the right blend of the need for entertainment, but the need to see life with a new seriousness.
And I think on top of that, and just before I hand it back to Professor Hodari, you mentioned something about, particularly the fund and the amount that was put into it. The equity of the theatre community and the theatre offering to the tourism industry and hospitality industry, I think, is finally now appreciated, because it also, not only does it create, I mean, the West End is a sub-brand of London. Broadway is a sub-brand of New York City. That's a part of the proposition. It also allows for repeat visitation, which is critical to get that momentum going. But I think that's where, like with every crisis, it's provided an X-ray on the ecosystem of a destination. And now finally, the theatre community and its contribution is appreciated as far of that engineering of a really world-class destination. So, Professor, over to you.
Yeah, I think we should probably switch over to our audience questions. I just wanted to say, when you were mentioning this about the theater goer maybe doing the one big event, the one big theater event, but not the regular commitment, it reminded me a little bit about travel and saying leisure demand right now is, I'm going to go on this big trip right now and just let my, unwind and really enjoy that. But the business traveler who was traveling 2 or 3 times a week will no longer commit to that. They may go to a big event that they need to, or a very big client, but they're not going to commit to regular travel. So I guess just another parallel and similarity between the industries.
I think that's so true. I think the analogy might be, yeah, we'll spend a lot of money on going to see our family in Australia because that's a one-off trip. But those once a month sort of city breaks to Berlin, no.
Agreed. Grace, do we have any questions from our audience?
Yes, we do. One of our first questions came in through email, and they wanted to know, Paul, how did you keep creative people motivated when they cannot create?
It was incredibly difficult because last summer, the more we were finding out about the pandemic, about the disease, the more it seemed directly, I took it very personally. It seemed like directly aimed at everything I'd devoted my entire life to, which is gathering people together in rooms to tell stories to each other. And I run a very small theatre with 180 seats in the round. And one of its great selling points has always been, you're in the room together. And that suddenly went from being an incredibly exciting thing to being literally dangerous to your health. And so part of what we've had to do is to reconnect with people and prove how fundamentally safe our building is, which it is. It's properly ventilated, and we've done all sorts of things to do with social distancing, masking, etc. Many, many mitigating factors. But it's the same thing with audiences as with artists. We're all taking baby steps again, a little bit like learning to walk as a child again. And I found that when I came back into rehearsals, we started up again in May. And so I was rehearsing in April when we were rehearsing while the lockdown was still in place, ready to open when it was scheduled to reopen. And we were all distanced in the room, in a rehearsal room with masks, etc., etc. And after, just over a year at that point of not doing it, it really felt very awkward. There wasn't a sort of, we were delighted to be doing it, but everyone said the same thing at the end of the day, like, do I remember how to do this at all? Why? And by the way, why am I absolutely exhausted? So I think we've all been through a lot, and I can only speak for the people in my line of work. But whether we've survived or not, financially or not, I think we've all gone through a trauma. And I think that's sometimes not acknowledged enough. And I think it's going to take quite a time for that to heal itself into, I think you're right, whatever the now normal is. So it's a long process. Now we were able, because we were supported financially, we were able to experiment in a way that we'd not done before, which is that we live streamed performances from the theatre without an audience. So way back in February, when everything was very, very locked down, we were able to produce 6 short new plays on the themes of inside and outside, which we live streamed from the theatre without any live audience there. And so that was a first for us, and it kept us in touch, and it enabled us to work with quite a number of artists to make that happen. So that was exciting at a rather grim moment.
Interesting.
Yeah, very, again, parallels to our industry in terms of even hotels, companies creating virtual travel experiences for people so they would not lose touch with the desire to travel and still be able to see new places just in a virtual way. Not the same thing, but a way to keep people engaged. Grace, let's take another question.
Yes, we've had a question come in from Steve, one of our regular viewers, and he says, the world of theatre lost a giant this past weekend. Does the London theatre community have any plans to celebrate the contributions of Mr. Sondheim?
A giant indeed, you know, who worked a lot. His productions, he had a lot of productions in London consistently over the years, and so many of my colleagues have worked, in some cases, very closely with him. So there's quite a personal feeling of loss around at the moment because of Sondheim. I am absolutely sure there will be enormous celebrations of his life and work to come once that feels a little bit more possible, because he was, you know, quite rightly revered in this town. And so many people have very, very personal reasons to be grateful to him. And he and his work changed lives. So I don't doubt there will be great celebrations of the life and work in due course.
Grace, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, we do. We had a question come in asking Paul, why did you dedicate your career to theatre?
Well, gosh, I don't know. This is probably a terrible analogy in the middle of a pandemic, but it is a bug. And I think once you catch it like I did as a teenager, the fact that you could both do it like I was doing it at school, and when I worked out that you could go to see plays and managed to work out how to do that. Unfortunately, there was just no way back. Now, fortunately or unfortunately for me personally, when I was 16 and was in a school play, I've been going to London to see plays. I've been acting, but I realized that directing was the thing to do, because you were not at the top of a pyramid of power, as some people perceive it, but that you were at the center of everything. So that if you liked the theatre, you were in touch with every aspect of putting on a play. And I thought, that's me, that's for me. And so I wanted to be a theatre director from the age of 16, which is irresponsibly early, I think.
It's fascinating. And I love the fact that you didn't want to be at the top, it's being the heartbeat of it. I have a question for you before we have to unfortunately close. I've always wondered this. At the beginning of the pandemic, you'd see all these incredible videos of performers training in their kitchens and doing pieces from Swan Lake or the Nutcracker, bouncing off of their kitchen cabinets. And that was all fascinating, and it was incredibly endearing, and it gave you a real sense of how the creative community was keeping active in the whole bit, but they have to keep fit. So whether they're artistic performers, athletes, I now watch them on stage and I'm thinking, how on earth, literally, did they maintain that muscle mass in a 1-bedroom flat in London? I don't understand that. How did they literally maintain their physical capability and their strength? Forget their emotional strength. But I just don't understand that. Help me understand that.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to think back now, but it was a very real moment early on when even the amount of time that you were allowed to exercise outdoors was rationed. And I think that affected a lot of performers at that point acutely, and they made use of their hour or whatever it was at that point hugely. So the parks were full of acting runners, if you see what I mean. And I remember there was a brief video of Ian McKellen doing it. You know, so the number of minutes and hours you were allowed to exercise as a performer suddenly became terribly important.
Indeed. But the person with whom you're performing normally, you're social distancing from, and you'll tip over. And I think that's where I always found, again, after we went through almost the shock or entertainment element of understanding the world we were in, the reality of staying in it, and just an athlete or a performer staying strong, that must have been, I mean, I was watching when The Lion King went back, because I spent 20 something years in South Africa. And so when I went back to see The Lion King, and there's there's a great video of when they came back to rehearse, and the tears of just singing again and that feed again. And I just think, oh my goodness, we have no idea that the art is the vocation. Ultimately, it's not a profession. And that off must have been incredible to have the supply come back.
Yeah. And it's not just a physical thing. It's so profoundly about connection. Artists have to connect with each other and then connect with an audience, and the audience connect together. It's all about connection. And this disease has disrupted connection. And so all our jobs from now on, regardless of how new variants play out, it's going to be a giant, multifaceted project in reconnection, re-socializing ourselves. And I think for young people in particular, depending on how we're measuring it, if we're talking about 2 years, that's a massive proportion of their life where their social connection and with each other and with the world has been profoundly disrupted. And I think we're going to be living with the consequences, the psychological, emotional, intellectual consequences of that for a very, very long time. And theatre, due to its very nature, even though it felt like the thing that was most fundamentally under attack by this disease, it is the thing that will reconnect us to each other, to ourselves, to the world, to society, because that's what it's about.
Indeed. And thankfully, there's a heightened appreciation for that. So before I hand it to Professor to close off, thank you so much. Clearly, we've loved this conversation, and thank you for everything you've done to keep that heartbeat strong and those pins up and toes on the tippy toes.
Not at all. It's been very, very enjoyable and stimulating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I think it was really important to see the similarities and some differences across the industries. And I think for our audience that are so tourism and hospitality focused, to branch out a little bit and get a perspective on another industry and how this has affected it and its staffing and customers, and see the parallels has been really useful for everybody. So thank you so much for that. And good luck going forward with your shows. And hopefully we'll be able to attend one of those, maybe the one that you give a leading role to Anita in the future. We'd love to come and see that. Okay.
Splendid. I look forward to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Bye-bye. One thing, Anita, I was thinking was, I don't know what percentage of hospitality employees are out of work or struggling actors. I mean, if you go to New York or LA, it's a big percentage. So given what's happening in the hospitality industry, of saying people don't want to work in this field anymore, but then the struggles that this industry has been having, I'm wondering if they're doubling down and saying, I'm no longer going to work in this industry and I'm no longer going to work in hospitality, or if hospitality is becoming maybe even more attractive to them because it's been a little bit easier to find work there, right? It's funny
to say that though, because I went recently with some girlfriends to a place in Soho, and it's a club where you go dancing, and the bar men and women are actually West End performers. So suddenly the person who's handed me a glass of champagne jumps up on this small table and breaks into a cover of Beyonce. It's fascinating. And their voices are amazing, but there is a symbiotic relationship there. You're absolutely right.
Okay. And Grace is subtly hinting that it's time for Total Knockout. Grace, what are we debating today?
Thank you, Demian. Today we are debating, assuming ongoing challenges continue with international travel, will domestic tourism once again be enough to satisfy us? Anita, take it away.
I love this question. I think it's so important because us has changed. Importantly, as we've said since the beginning, when governments shut down borders, they still allowed people to travel domestically to get the ecosystem of the travel community going, but also to be able to let people get out and keep travel as strong as it was as a value. This allowed destinations to get ready for the local market, create new products and services, and really think about how do you get that same traveler back over and over. That was great. Engineering's great. But more importantly, for the travelers, exactly as Paul has said, they've become much more conscious of recognizing where their travel money goes, where their travel interest goes. So I think there's a lot more value and appreciation of domestic travel in a way that it never was before. It used to be the poor cousin. Now it's the sibling we make sure is taken care of in our family itself. So I think it's brilliant. It's exactly about people understanding where the money is going. They've got the ROI financially and emotionally. And as we see domestic travel, when things get scary internationally, it's a fabulous plan B. So I think there's a different appreciation, which is going to make people think differently and say, yeah, I'm not going to go away. I don't want the risk. I want to stay home and I want to see that my travel money is doing good.
Look, I think you a couple of key words, right? We do recognize the importance of it more. We do appreciate domestic tourism more. We're all for it, but you did say it's a plan B, and that's the issue, right? A plan B is no longer enough to satisfy us. We lived through that for a year and a half. Now we've been tempted by international travel again. You can see the numbers of people flying international and traveling international has skyrocketed, in many cases surpassing pre-pandemic levels. No way are people going to be satisfied once again saying, well, I can't go see my father in Canada or my family in South Africa or go to the States to see family and friends. So I don't think it's going to satisfy us anymore. It's also not going to satisfy the companies anymore that have been suffering financially, that rely on this. We both know how much airlines, for example, count on business travel and international travel. So plan B, yes. Important, yes. Recognize, yes. But the question was, will it once again, as it did maybe a year ago, be enough to satisfy us? I got to say, I don't think it's enough to satisfy us. Okay, Grace, that was a quick TKO given our time constraint. Back to you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, your time to vote. Do you agree with Anita that us has changed? We need to keep travel strong as a value, and for travellers, they become much more conscious of where their money goes. It is a fabulous plan B. Or do you agree with Demian that we do recognise and appreciate more, but plan B is not enough to satisfy us? We can't see family and friends internationally, and it's not enough to satisfy companies that do rely on international travel.
All right, let's see those results.
Interesting.
Well, that was a tough one for you, but you chose the yes side. I think we both know people want to travel internationally. They want to go out and explore. They want to see people. Tough to argue that it's going to be enough. But I agree. I think the most important is we've learned to do it better. The businesses, hotels, entertainment areas have figured out a little bit better how to focus on their local and domestic customers. And I think that's going to help them survive the next lockdowns.
Absolutely.
All right, Anita, next episode.
We have our next episode on December 13th, and it's our finale episode for 2021. Who could have imagined? We're going to have a very fun one as we are bringing Intel on stage. We're having some of our intelligence partners come on to talk about another next normal, looking at what's the year ahead and some of the senses of what do we need to keep an eye on to get a sense of what is going to be ahead of us. We have Haldane Dodd from the aviation side, the acting executive director of ATAG. We have Jan Freitag, a complete ongoing supporter of RISE, which is fantastic, who is pitching for Professor Hodari's job, though admittedly, I might give him my seat next year and you two can co-host itself.
That would be fun.
joining us again from STR. And we have Carolyn Bremner, who we had earlier as well, joining us from Euromonitor, Head of Travel and Tourism Research, a great source of getting a sense of what are the travelers looking at and where do they want to go. So please do join us on December 13th. It'll be a really interesting one and a fun one to close off 2021. As I hand over to Professor Hodari, from my side, stay strong, stay confident, stay hopeful, keep your hands clean, stay with RISE, and see you on December 13th. Professor.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Make sure you let your family, friends, and pets know about our show. Watch us on YouTube or anywhere else. See you on the 13th of December. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.